What have you heard so far? There's no right answer. What have you heard so far? In addition to everything? Maz, what have you heard so far?
Start early, do it consistently.
Okay. What else? Go. Sorry? Yep. Our youth minister's wife at Eastside, Clay's youngest, Clay Bryant,
Jason.
goes out to the mailbox with his mom one day and he says, "Mom, why don't I ever get any mail? I was the ghostwriter for our elders. If our young men did something in singing or whatever, the elders sent them a note. If special activities happened, the elders sent them a note. The next day," he's 4 years old, they go out to the mailbox and Mom says, "Guess what? You have a letter from the church with your name on it." She said he carried it around for 30 minutes before he opened it. He finally got a letter with his name on it. And just be thinking, if we can do it with letters, there's other ways we can do that. Every time we can give that positive affirmation. We prevent a lot of discipline by bringing discipline. I had an 11th grader, he said, "I get in trouble sometimes just to see if my dad loves me." And I thought, you didn't grow up in my house. That just would never have happened. What else have you heard?
Then you start with the attitude, then you follow with the facts, and then the third one, was that an action?
Yes.
And then we don't get
Yes. Yes. And be thinking, like I said, we're the two older ones, and if you kind of know us, then you know we're very structured. And I don't say that negatively, and we're not rigid, but we are very structured. There were 3 times I sat our kids down and said, "Your mom and dad owe you an apology. We have not been consistent on this and this the last little bit. Starting tonight, we want to ask your forgiveness because we as parents have been consistent, and here are our new boundaries and our new expectations for where we're going." And see, if we parents bring discipline to the family, we prevent a lot of discipline, and every time you can catch your kids doing something right, never let them forget it. Some kids only hear from their parents when they do something wrong. Now, we're going to go warp speed for some of these. You're Bereans, you'll get the details. If you look under the dotted line, look at those 3 things. Faith is a catalyst. It causes action. Faith is a conviction, and that's what the 5 steps are. And faith is a commitment. Martin Luther, "Here I take my stand." My favorite verse in the whole Bible about faith is at the very bottom. Abraham was fully persuaded God had the power to do what he promised. If you look on the back, and I'll leave you to read the rest of it, there's 3 things. I'm on the back on page 4. In Paul, faith is primarily looking back, especially what God did on the cross. I've been crucified with Christ. When was that? That's something in the past. John, faith is a verb, it's an activity. Faith is an action in the present. And guess what? The Hebrew writer is, faith is something that's in the future. We are not going to develop fully mature Christians while they're children, but every time I see a big oak tree, and especially these 2 gum trees, this one over here and even the one up there, have grown so much from when we first came. How does an oak tree get started? A little bitty seed was planted. And that's what we want to be doing, is planting those seeds, let God to help to nourish, to go from there. If you look at page 5, you'll see things to repeat. Right in the middle, under the benchmark, God says in Genesis, of all things, 18, 17 through 19, "I have chosen Abraham that he will charge his children and his household to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." The two primarily ethical and moral terms in the prophets we are first introduced to with the charge for Abraham to teach Isaac to live and do by these things. Look at the stages at the bottom. When you look at the baby, and I'm just looking at how the New Testament describes the development of children, okay? You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Timothy, from infancy, it's the same word for baby, little bitty guy. So this tells us Lois and Eunice were talking to Timothy about Scripture probably while he was nursing a little bitty guy. From a child, you have known these things. And then the next one is a small child, and this is Moses. She took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. Samuel, mom nursed her son until she weaned him. The boy grew in the presence of the Lord. And then we're going to find Jesus is also going to grow. Then here's 12 through 16. Here he is, and again, sitting, listening, asking questions. At 17, this is amazing. Joseph doesn't say, your husband might find out. Joseph doesn't say, you might become pregnant. Here's this probably beautiful woman throwing herself at him, and what does Joseph say? How can I sin against God? Isn't that amazing? Hundreds of miles away from home, and here's just an obvious temptation, and look at what that tells us about faith development. Luke was in year 10, going into 11, and he talked about this 2 or 3 days later. He said, Dad, I was invited to a party. When I got there, I noticed 3 things. 1, there were no adults. We're 10th graders, 11th graders, just no adults. 2, some people already started drinking. And 3, some couples had already headed toward the bedroom. He said, I walked through the house and I said, I don't belong here, and I left. Now, my kids didn't do everything right, but what's happening? By 10th and 11th grade, who I am is more important than just being accepted and doing what my friends are doing at this particular time. And so here's a target, here's an example. Look at Daniel. He's carried 900 miles away. They are youth without blemish, on and on. But Daniel 1 and 8, Daniel resolved he wouldn't defile himself. You are greatly loved. You set your mind to understand and humble yourself. And when you look at these 3 stages developmentally, then here are specific examples you can go back and look and say, aha, this is in Scripture what was going on at this particular stage, at this particular stage. Everybody follow where I'm at? And I'll leave you to look at the rest of that. Turn the page. At the top, number 1, the foundation for intergenerational faith is the older people. It's harder to be faithful if you don't have any faithfulness as your role models for the ones who are ahead. Positive example, and I don't say this to pat myself on the back, I have never yelled at our kids. There's still hope, but I haven't yelled at them yet. I have lowered my voice and talked intently many times. As adults, we choose how we interact, and guess what? The way we interact with them is going to be the way they're going to interact with us. And I'll tell you more about my grandfather, who's a big influence on this. You'll see the term structured and teachable moments. And I just want to close with this thing about Joseph and nation and God, especially if you're a Bible class teacher, but it's true for parents. Genesis 37 through 50, biographical person. We can come back. The nation, what God's doing to develop a great nation. The one we don't do enough on, we can do the same thing and talk about God. Oh, you meant this for evil, but what? God meant it for good. And as we teach, those are 3 levels that we can work with. It's harder to teach about the top one if you don't know anything about the middle ones. But I want to encourage you to do that. Can we do one picture real quick? One slide? I want you to look at a part of our family history. My mom, knowing we were going to move halfway around the world, wanted to do a family portrait. And so Our older sister Cynthia was 5 years old, but she was like Mother Teresa. She was cooking by the time she was 4 with my grandmother. And those are her 3 kids. This is my mom and my dad. Dad was a jockey. He drove the last team of mules plowing cotton. And he'd worked so hard his elbows wouldn't go straight because he had worked so. See, his elbows are bent. When he stood up, he couldn't straighten his elbows because he had worn them out. You know the 2 people in the middle? This is my sister between Kent and I. But the drama behind this is that here's this, and it's going to be a very expensive family portrait for the ages. My brother shows up with a girl who doesn't have a ring on. My mother is hot. She is smiling in this photograph, but that was about the only smile of the day. And I want you to notice something very carefully. What's going on right here? Nancy, Ken has brought Nancy to our family photograph. They're not officially engaged. And so Nancy has put her right hand over her left hand because she doesn't have a ring. And I made everything better. I says, Mom, if it's Susie or Janie, we'll just do some white out and then we can paste this other girl in the picture. I just can't tell you. Ted knows my mom. My mom, I just can't tell you how, and aggravated doesn't even begin. I mean, she is ready to choke Kent that here we're going to have this historic family moment and have this picture. And they have been dating. But if you know Kent, he's just thinking, oh, this will be okay. We'll just put Nancy in this family picture. And my mom is just not happy at all. Well, the reason I'm telling you this is that we move here, and Heather is born in Royal North Shore. And a part of every evening, and we'll talk about this later, we read Jesus, the Friend of Children. We start doing our Bible questions or verses and stuff. And so as soon as Heather is born, Luke's in one hand, Heather's in the other. And when Heather can talk, she can answer all the questions, because she's been sitting there listening from the first day she came home from the hospital. And so we would do that, sing some songs, and then before we went to bed, we're halfway around the world. And so here's your Aunt Cynthia, here's Uncle Kent, here's your grandma, here's your granddad. And we would do that each night and just let them see the family that they couldn't see that's halfway around the world. We fly home, Heather's 18 months, and there's a whole story, which I won't get into. We were exhausted. From acceleration to touchdown, it was 21 hours, 45 minutes, and 50 seconds. And we stopped in Hawaii to do customs, getting off in possible snow and ice, and we have coats at 3:30 in the morning going through customs. Sheila is pregnant with Annalise. This is the 3rd of December. Annalise is born the 27th. Letter, please. Every time we got on an airplane, they wanted to see the doctor's letter. We just could hardly get off. My dad was never anywhere to be seen when we left. He was never there. He was either farming or Dad just couldn't be there when we left. We could go to the gate, and my dad was there an hour before we got there. So we have Heather on my left hip, Luke here, bags. We walk out the door. Dad's got his cowboy hat and his boots on. And Heather is 18 months, and she's never seen him before, and she says, "That's my granddaddy." And she puts her arms out, and she hugs him around the neck, and he starts crying. He can't understand a word that she's saying. And his name is Marshall, and we named her Heather Marshall. And so here's an 18-month-old granddaughter that he has never seen. And literally, when we finally stagger off the plane, and Heather's right here, here's my dad, and he's been there for an hour. Every time he was the first one there, but he wouldn't be there when we left. And what did it say to my dad when a granddaughter he had never seen walks off the plane and holds her arms out and says, "My granddaddy"? What would it be if our children did the same thing with our Heavenly Father? Having not seen, we love Him. I was listening to Chuck Swindoll one day. He's Baptist, but he's a great speaker. And he just asked a question. He said, "Does a blind mother love her children any less than a sight mother?" Maz, you probably worked with some blind mothers. How does a blind mother do it?
Everything else.
Everything else. We had a blind mother that would ride a bus in Campbelltown, and I never interfered, but it was amazing. All of her other senses are really strong. Does a blind mother love the children that she hasn't seen any more than you as a sight mother? See, we're talking about faith, being able to see that which is unseen as a present reality. And that's one of the things we want to work for. If you'll flip it back, we're going to hand out the next one and do some highlights of it. I started saying, are we going to use the same handouters, or are we going to... They've had some practice, they'll do better this time. So when you get this, I know most of you, you're careful Bible students, you'll be able to read through the details, but look at just the ongoing discussion about, and I use the term intergenerational faith. And I've thought about this, Abraham's going to teach Isaac, Joshua, me and my house. Nearly the last verse of the Old Testament says, and it's about Elijah, he will come and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. And guess how the New Testament opens? 2 sets of 14 generations of intergenerational faith. And so these are examples. I'm going to leave you to read most of those. You can look through those and just see the details that are there. But it's going to be Abraham, Joshua, starting in chapter 24, me and my house, Judges. I think this is one of the saddest verses in the Old Testament. There arose a generation that didn't know the Lord. Nearly every time I read that, I go, dun, 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 this is not going to be good. And then here's Samuel and David and Solomon. Turn the page. You'll see Kings. What I'm about to do drove Les Totman just absolutely nuts. He said, if I could remember how you can remember, I can remember what you said, but I can't remember how you remember it, so I have no idea what you do. I love acronyms. And so my acronym for our house is the word pick. Like you pick something up, pick axe. And I'll give them to you, but we'll talk about them. Prayer. Single most important thing we do from beginning to end is being prayerful about it. I is to be intentional. We're going to be very focused, be very specific on what we're going to do, and especially guys, we, as often as we can, we need to under-promise and over-perform with our children, especially when they're small, compared to over-promising, and sometimes that happens. But boy, it's hard to overcome parents who over-promise, and you've dealt with small children who are just so disillusioned. We were going to do this and going to do that. As often as we can, under-promise, over-perform, but being intentional. C, very similar, is being consistent. You may not be as structured as Sheila and I are, but what's more important is that you are consistent with who you are rather than you're kind of this way for a month and then it's this way for a month and then the changes just take place here and there. And then the last one is the K for just knowing God. Okay? So go back to prayer. Some of you heard me mention this. I was with Sheila for an entire semester and was so smitten that every time I got close to her, I could not get anything to come out of my mouth. I got next to her 5 times and just nothing happened. It just... And I guess you thought I was maybe deaf and mute or something because I was just... I was trying to say something and just... I don't know why. It just wouldn't happen. This is how traumatic it was. I'm in New Testament survey with Hugo McCord. It's January the 12th, and at 8:45, I'm going to count to 3 and take a breath and ask that girl out, and I nearly passed out. Well, I'm not going to take a deep breath this time. I'm going to count to 3, and I went over and I said, if we have a game Friday night, would you like to go out and eat afterwards? And she said, well, you're the basketball player. You're supposed to know. I thought, oh, this is great. Got her in the palm of my hand. And I said, well, let me rephrase that. Assuming we have a basketball game Friday night, would you like to go eat? And she said, yes. And I said, are you sure? we had an expression called "go crawl under a rock," and I just assumed I was going to ask her out, and she would say, "Get lost. No, I'm not interested." And if you know my wife, the Israelite in whom there's no guile, she said, "I did say yes, didn't I?" And I said, "Well, I just wanted to be sure that you wanted to do that." So we go out for our first date, and obviously a lot to learn about our families, and her mom especially was just wonderful, a great Bible student. But anyway, we had probably been dating a couple of months, and we went to an all-school retreat, and so it was great. We went to a school retreat. We don't use this term in my generation, but the speaker said, "I can tell some of you are sweet on each other," which we knew what he meant, but we wouldn't have said that. And he said, "If you end up getting married, you're probably going to have teenagers, and rather than worrying about them, why don't you just start praying for them now?" I mean, think about it. Peter has teenagers and his hair has turned gray. Isn't that true? Well, it's not black anymore, I'll say that. Little inside humor there. And the guy said, "Why don't you start praying for them right now?" So I told Sheila, I said, "Well, it's too noisy in here. It's kind of misting outside. We have an umbrella. Would you mind going out?" And we start. That's a real hardship when you're first dating a girl and you have to stand under an umbrella in light rain in order to be able to pray. And so in March of 1971, we start praying for the possibility of being a family and having children. So we have been praying for Luke for 7 years before he's born. Since we were under the umbrella, we might as well start praying for in-laws. And so we started praying for Kate and David and Michael, not knowing who they were, and praying for them and their children, for someone who our children might marry someday. And so we were praying for them. I did 2 of the weddings of the 3. And as we did the wedding, I said, "We welcome you into our family as an answer to God's prayer. We have been praying for you since March, April of 1971. Our kids aren't always going to do everything they ought to, regardless of what our kids are doing. That doesn't keep us from praying for them. They don't have to be our kids for us to be praying for them. And so when I'm doing this acronym and saying, "Oh, we're developing intergenerational faith," the very first thing that comes to mind is we need to be prayerful. Hannah, Samson's folks. You look at Mary as a young girl when spoken to, and I think the most important single thing we can do in intergenerational faith is to be praying for our kids, physical and spiritual. Intentional. We began having devotionals the very first day they came home, and we'll close with this on this tonight. We found this wonderful book, and it's out of print now, but it's called Jesus, the Friend of Children. And it has these fabulous, fabulous pictures. And I'll leave it up. It's now like the big picture book. And I don't know if we can get it in Australia, and there's others. I'm not saying that's the only one. We wore 2 of these out. And they're just absolutely magnificent pictures with a text. And so from the very first day, Luke didn't say a whole lot when we started doing our devotionals, but we started doing our devotional from the first day and talking about this, having a song, started talking about the verses, and that was a part of who we were as a family from the day they came home from the hospital. But how important is it for children to know Jesus is the friend of children? And we're going to close with that in a little bit. Being consistent. I can't accomplish anything with let me say it the other way. It's disillusioning to small children when things aren't consistent around them. Children like routine. And a part of doing a devotional before we go to bed, some kids like to stay up. Heather was our night owl. She'd been glad to have a devotional for 2 or 3 hours. I'm sound asleep on 12 Chisholm Street. We had a little light, and the moon came in occasionally. I feel something, I'm this way, and I feel something breathing on me, and Heather's right here, and I'm this way, and her eyes are the other. The moon is glowing off of her face, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and she says, "Father, let's get up and chat." I said, "Heather, We are not going to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and chat. You go get a book and do not wake your brother up. He needs his sleep. But Heather, we are not going to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to chat. Well, we did our part as parents to be very consistent with what we were doing. And that's as important for teenagers as it is for little kids. Then when you look at the next and you turn the page, knowing God, Hosea 4 and 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Look at those things. What's important? Oh, Jeremiah 9, he understands and knows me that I am the Lord. And there's a verse we mentioned in Malachi, turning the hearts of children and parents to each other. Under the dotted line, and again, you're listening to structured people, but I'm convinced of this. When a child comes home from the hospital, someone starts getting trained. Either the parents start training the child or the child starts training the parents. I'm in the doctor's office in Campbelltown. He's about, he's 6'4". He has that football look. Outside linebacker or poker, just this hunk of a guy. And Julie is 4. And I'm there and she fusses and whines a little bit. And then in a minute, Dad goes up to the counter and says, we're going to have to set another appointment. Julie has decided she doesn't want to see the doctor today. And I'm going inside. No! In grocery stores, I put my hands inside my pocket and got a hold of the pocket and left stuff in the cart so I don't get involved in something that's none of my business. Pardon? I just have such an aversion in that what is kind of cute and kind of funny at 4 gets really ugly at 14. And you think if a 4-year-old is running the family at 4, this is going to get really, really ugly before it's over. And that's what I'm saying. I literally have, with this going on and children just whining, complaining and stuff, we'll get with this later, but just still important. Lynn McMillan had this thing. He said, from 1 to 11, do not reason with the child until they have done what they've been asked to do cheerfully. And I told my kids, do what we ask you to. And guys, it's important we reinforce what mom asked them to do. And I told our kids, we will talk with you till the cows come home after you've done what we ask you to do. We're not going to reason with a 4 or 5-year-old. We want you to learn. And you stop and think, if I can't be obedient to earthly parents, how can I be obedient to a heavenly Father? From 12 on, this is why we have asked you to do this becomes really important. But he said from 1 to 11, it's really important that our kids learn to listen and to cheerfully obey and do what they're asked to do. This is my opinion, but I'm really convinced about it. I'm convinced that counting is trained disobedience. I'm going to count to 5. 1, and this is what I've heard, 2, 3, 3.5, 4. And what's the parent doing? They're actually training the child to not obey. And we just had a really clear policy. When your mother asks you to do something, we expect you to do it. No chat, no talk back. After you've done it, we can talk forever. And then as they get older, we're more than willing to do that. Proverbs 22, train up a child. And we're going to talk about this more later in the way they should go. I think the proverb writer would assume that he wants them to be faithful. Every child is totally different. They have a different set of gifts, a different bend, and we'll talk about that later. When you look at number 2, and this is a part again, doing the education majors, but I read something on developing character, and this person's feelings was, for every year that I allow an inappropriate behavior, it's going to take a minimum of consistently changing that a month if I have any hope of changing the 1 year of misbehavior. So if I've let misbehavior go on for 6 years, how many parents have the backbone to correct for 6 months in a row to change that behavior. You see the reason why most kids' character by 10 and 12 is already formed? Because if they've been misbehaving this long, the parents don't have the strength or the conviction to be that consistent to redo that. And that molding of character is really, really important. And that's why when I read those verses, train up a child, parents, that's God's given responsibility for us. I've mentioned number 3. Here's number 4. And this to me is really, really important. I know people who've done everything right. And because our children have free will, our children can still choose a lifestyle other than how they were raised. And I've talked with some parents who have just untold guilt about, this has happened and this has happened. But think about this. This is hard to say, but it's still true. Through the years, I've told some people, do you know who has had more failure as a parent than anyone else? God. If it required 51 righteous people for the sun to come up, we would be living in darkness. We've had wonderful rain the last couple of days. If it required 51% of righteous people for it to rain, we'd be living in the Sahara Desert. God gives us what we need, not what we deserve. And even when my children disappoint me and don't live as they have been trained, I'm able to relate in a very small way to how God feels about the majority of his children. As our son grew up, we'd had some really deep discussions, and he had a major faith crisis, like in the year 10, 11. We're talking about sometimes diarrhea and really upset. And he said, Dad, if God knew that so many people were going to choose to do wrong, why did God allow us to have free will? 13 and 14 years old, and that is just eating him up. And we talked to some older godly men. But one of the responses was, well, matey, this may not be the answer because God is God. However, I think the joy and the pleasure of those who choose to love him and choose to follow him is going to be a greater reward for God than the majority who choose not to. Because we're not robots, we're not angels, and because we were formed with free will, the fact that we have chosen, and the two words of the citizens of heaven used 13 times are servants and saints, the sanctified ones. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked with through the years that are just beating themselves up. We did everything we could. I know people who had devotionals twice a day with their children, and at a certain point as adults, they've turned away from God. The parents are not responsible for that, and that the children have chosen to do that. But notice this, and you guys that work in medicine have seen this in different ways. Here's an event that takes place, and I'm going to use the word Job like just to illustrate. Some people are going to experience that and turn away from God and never come back. And another person is going to experience the same kind of tragedy with their kids or their family, and what are they going to do? They're going to turn to God. And that's a part of the importance of being prayerful all the way. God loves my children more than I do before they come into the world. Next page. I encourage you, one of the anchor verses is that first part of Psalm 78. And Lord willing, that's going to be a part of our sermon on Sunday. But look at this. Fathers have told us we will not hide it from their children, but we will tell it to the coming generation. Look down. He commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them. Children yet unborn will arise and tell their children. How many generations are being talked about? At least 4. And you see why this thing about the fingerprints of faith, the intergenerational faith, is so important. And this is from the family of Asaph, and I'll give you the bottom line tonight. And we'll see this, Lord willing, on Sunday. We can account for 600 years of faithfulness with the family of Asaph. David had choose, I'm going to say grandfather. David chooses Asaph to lead the worship in the temple, and anticipate every time there's a restoration movement, Hezekiah, Jehoshaphat, Josiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, we can account for 600 years that every time we're going to do it like our father David did, we call on the family of Asaph. And stop and think, and this is going to be one of the bottom lines, if Christ doesn't come back for another 600 years, will there be anybody in your family worshiping God? If Christ doesn't come back for 600 years, will there be anybody in the Macquarie congregation generationally worshiping God? And that's where we're headed, Lord willing, on Sunday morning. Okay, next page. You see this 2-3? We're going to talk about this in different ways. Well, let me say this. Satan is causing so much problem, and let me stay American. There is so much gender confusion going on right now that irreparable harm is being done to small kids and families. And to have a little boy grow up to be a little boy and happy that God made him that way, and a little girl to be a little girl and be happy with being that, is so important. And this whole thing with gender identity is going to become more and more of an issue as time goes by, especially for those of us who are Christian. Train them up in the way they should go. If you'll see that term under number 2-3, every child has a bend in life. When Luke is 10, he starts talking about computers. We had 2 guys here who had a lot of computer knowledge, and this 10-year-old said, I did da-da-da-da, and they'd say, oh, you need to do da-da-da-da. And by 12, these 2 guys had talked Luke through everything a computer could do. He's now in IT because that was his bend. Okay, get ready. Heather at 12, our middle one, says, Father. I've always been Father. She's Elizabethan. She says, Father, not NIV, but I want a King James version of the plays of Shakespeare. I said, okay, tell me that again. I want a King James version of the plays of Shakespeare. So at 12 years of age, she's never studied at a desk, never studied in the library, on the floor, on the couch. She would do her homework, and in 6 months, she read completely through the plays of Shakespeare twice. Father, I can tell you the plot. I can tell you what the major characters are, and I can tell you when they get knocked off. So if you go to Shakespeare in the Park with Heather on the blanket, she'll nudge you and say, Father, here comes his best line in the play. Sheila and I are asking, where on earth did this child come from? Because that's not either one of us. But can I use the word bend? That's her bend in life. Annalise is the clone of her wonderful mother. 3rd grade, when I grow up, I am going to Oklahoma Christian, and I am going to become a counselor. And she is a marriage and family therapist today. Listen carefully. The most unfair thing I can do to my children is treat them all exactly the same when it comes to their bend and their aptitude. We had a coach who was a fabulous coach, and as kids were coming, I got to talk with him, and he'd coached for a number of years, and I said, how are you raising your boys? And he said, well, the worst mistake I can make is to try to clone my boys into the same things that I did and I'm interested in. And he said, my philosophy is that I study my kids, and whatever my son is interested in, I'm going to become a student, and I'm going to learn as much about his interest as I can. And then he said, one of my boys loves sports. He loves basketball. And he said, that one's easy because that's who he is. He said, and the other one became a doctor. So he said, I learned a whole vocabulary I had never heard before. We went to science camps instead of basketball camps. And he said, what we need to do, train them up in the way they should go. The benefit of people who have more than 2 children or 3, especially like for us, to have the easy one first. If you'd had the second one first, you might not have had any more. They're so different. They come that way. That's their God-given. So my job is not to make them something that they're not, or make them like their brother or their sister. My job is to bring out whatever aptitude and giftedness that they have. And our POCA has invested years. We co-directed church camps for nearly 20 years. And he'll just tell you our kids are just as different as night and day, but they also share a commonality of faith, a commonality of background and other things. But we've worked really hard, focus on the bend, and when you find out something they're interested in, support and push that as much as you can. When I was doing my studies, Ross Campbell had this wonderful little book called How to Really Love a Child. And I'm regretful I can't do this as much as I used to, but I'm doing with little children. He said 3 things: have eye contact. Have you ever made eye contact with your mother in church when you're misbehaving? Not good in our family, but it also included my grandmother and my aunt. We had 40 of us in church that were related, so you might as well walk the straight and narrow. If you misbehave at school, you better come home and confess so they hear your version first, because my aunt was the school secretary, and there were 10 relatives in this small country school in church. And if you ever got in trouble, come home and get your part in first and take whatever's coming, because you don't want your aunt or the 10 other, and we've got a sister and a brother and a sister. Confession's good for the soul. Well, when you look at the bend and the growth, it's important that we allow that to take place. But let's do this positively. How many little kids don't know how to look you in the eye? Or the only time we look at them is when they're in trouble. Let me do the 3 and then come back. Focused attention. Okay, here's a pet peeve of mine. I nearly scream when I go to, and you fill in the blank, McDonald's or something, and here's a young mother with 2 children, and guess what she's doing? She's on her phone, and I'm thinking they're going to be gone before you know it, and here you have a golden opportunity to talk with them. Eye contact, focused attention, and listen very carefully. If I can't listen to you when you're little bitty and with the chatter, why should you listen to me when you're older and I'm wanting to talk with you about life and ethics and morality? And that's why that's really, really important. Just da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Those things are really, really important, especially from the child's point of view. And then the other one's focused, appropriate church, physical touch. My niece won't let me do this as much, but for years, we were at the East Side 41 years in all. They had us here for 12 years, and we stayed with them. Every time a 3-year-old little kid came up, I tried to drop down on one knee and try to be as close to their eye level as we could. And with all the small kids, I was called Big Hug. And if you come to church, especially Brianna Hayes, from 3 on, she would not leave church until Big Hug had given her a hug. It was also a bear hug. And we're so glad you're here. She was 5, and she said, Big Hug, we're going on vacation for 3 weeks, so I need 3 hugs before I leave today. I couldn't lose 80 pounds and become Skinny Hug. That doesn't have the same the same touch to it. But what are we trying to do? We're glad you're here. So I want to have positive eye contact. And rather than doing this and doing this, then I love to just get down on one knee and be as close to them as I could. And whatever they want to say, I've got time to listen to, be very specific about that. And if it's appropriate, and some kids don't, but again, here's a long-term relationship. One of our young mothers came out and she said, I have figured out my daughter has listened to your voice from as early as she could in the womb. And she was tired and misbehaving today, and we went out in the foyer, and we got her in the speaker, and she heard your voice, and she just went out like a light. And I got to thinking, she has heard that all of her life. And I said, well, I'm multi-talented. It's not just children. I can do that with teenagers. I can do that with 30-year-olds. I can put old people to sleep. I have a real gift for that. But think about it. From as soon as she could hear, she has always heard my voice. How we say something may be as important, if not more important, than what we say. My dad on the farm, you can't fool dogs and you can't fool little kids. And so those 3 things are really, really important for us. And teachers, kids who come to church, and you think, how often as an adult can I do those 3 things? Rather than waiting until they misbehave positive reinforcement, and how many times can I say, oh, we're glad you're here. Thanks for coming today. Thanks for being helpful in class today. Thanks for answering a question. See, again, we create discipline by bringing discipline. And when we create that expectation, then we can build that in and do those three things: eye contact, focused attention, and appropriate touch. The ones on the bottom are just the importance of growing. And you'll see grow and grow and grow and grow. So if you'll turn to 2.6. Even look at Dr. Luke and see, isn't this interesting? God chooses a Gentile doctor to give us more details about the physical growth of Jesus as a child into adult as any of the other writers in the New Testament. And I won't do any of the Greek words, but when you look at these, each of these are different words from conception to him growing up as a small child. So when you read from 3:1 down through 3:5, then Dr. Luke gives us a physical, detailed description of the physical development of the birth of the incarnate Son of God. I just find that very, very interesting, and you can see the details of the growth and growing into childhood from there. If you look down at 3:1, again, we started sometime on Saturday by saying Sunday is the best day of the week. Sunday is the heart attitude. So we start sometime on Saturday. Sunday is the best day of the week. Going to Gosford, what's the company that did the little frozen things? That'd be apricot and cherry. There's a Sara Lee, plant or something at Gosford. So if we went up to visit, we'd buy a bunch of those and freeze those. We'd have something like, and Sheila worked really hard at this, we would have something every Sunday that maybe we didn't have the rest of the week. And the goal was, she would start breakfast, I would get ready, and if you'll lay the clothes out while you're finishing breakfast, I'll start getting what eventually were 3 kids ready, because we need to have a teamwork here. But starting sometime Saturday, we'd say, guess what? We need to get to bed tonight, because tomorrow is the best day of the week. We get to be with our spiritual family. We go now on family holiday, and we're about 30 kilometers from Old Mexico. So when I say the bottom of Texas, I mean we're at the bottom of Texas. It's a church of 30 people. In the wintertime, they're called snowbirds. People will come from the snow. So this church of 30 may be 80, 90 during our American winter, and then the snowbirds go home. And they said in the past, the most depressing weekend was Memorial Day. The snowbirds have gone home, and if half us are gone, a church of 30 is now 15. And guess what? 16 of the Hartman family start coming. We walk in the door, and Rusty says, David, Lord's Supper today? Yes, sir. Michael, first prayer. Yes, sir. Luke, closing prayer. Mr. Hartman leading singing tonight. Dave said, can we please take your family pictures and put them up on our membership board, because we talk to the snowbirds about you when you're not here, and we do a countdown every year, because the last weekend in May, whatever they're doing for the week, we're going to jump in and do. We could worship in the room, but why should we do that when we can be with our spiritual family? And so what are we cultivating? What we do with mom, dad, and the kids, then we get to benefit in doing that. In between years 2 and 3 of university, Heather came to me and says, Father, I'm going on a campaign to South America. I said, oh, good, Heather. Who are you going with? She said, myself. I said, what? She said, well, some people don't need a group to have an identity, and I'm going to go to South America this summer. I said, Heather, dear old dad's not going to put you on a plane to unknown destination. I mean, we need a little structure here. She said, well, it'll all work out. I go and talk to the missions teacher, and I said, help. She's not afraid of thunder and lightning, and she's wanting to go to South America and work with her Spanish this summer. And he said, well, Santiago has 5 couples and 2 single girls. If Heather was my daughter, I'd send her to Santiago. So we did. And her roommate had grown up in Venezuela, was a student at Harding, and so Heather spent, I don't know if it's nearly 2 months in South America. I'm giving her a hug in the airport, and she's nearly as tall as I am, and she whispers in my ear, Father, I'm getting to go meet a part of our spiritual family we've never met before. And so, again, can we develop a culture in our family and in this family so that who we are as the family of God is more important than the world's culture and the things going on around us on the outside? Look at 3-4 in the bottom. Our kids don't come to stay, they come to go. I mean, Pam, how passive. You know, we turn around, our kids are getting a driver's license. And our youngest, Annalise, our youngest, like I said, we have 8. Our youngest is 8 years old now. And Annalise was talking to Sheila, and she says, Mom, we're nearly half done. And so when we get really tired and we hear chatter, 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 all of our kids were 18 or 20 months. At one time, Sheila said, do you know I've either been pregnant or nursing for 6 years in a row? And I said, well, I knew it had been a while. She said, no, it's been an eternity. I would come home from teaching one day and she'd say, we will now speak in whole sentences. We will use big people's words. You will not wipe snot on me when you hug me. And I would say, do we need to leave or do you need to leave? And she said, would you please go feed the ducks so I can just listen to the silence of the walls of my house for a change and not have some, you can just imagine Heather going da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Yes, we will go feed the ducks. Well, that, again, there's that partnership, but when we get tired, we need to realize they don't come to stay. And there's a real sense they're not ours. They're actually given to us on loan from God. So when you turn the page, and here's important questions. Does your family come to church again as participants or spectators? And we told our kids, we can do everything at church except the Lord's Supper. And so on Sunday, we do that with this particular group here. And then who was the questions? Well, who are you going to encourage today? Who are you going to talk with, and how are you going to do that? Look at the very bottom. Speak, Lord, your servant hears. What a great thing for a young child to hear. And look at the molding of the heart. Hannah, God, teach us and tell us what to do. And again, with Timothy, there's no one like him. But look at number 2 at the very bottom. If you look up the word righteous, and this is hard to say, but let me say it this way. We had a man come when we were at Oklahoma Christian. He basically said, I feel sorry for all you poor kids who grew up in the church and didn't grow up in the world to appreciate your salvation like I do. And I'm sitting here thinking, yes, but God didn't have Jesus raised in a brothel. When you look, the word righteous or right, all of the people around Jesus when he's small are righteous people. It's not all in the same gospel. When you look, the Word becomes flesh and dwelt among us, and God wanted him to have, as he grows up as a small child, all the people around him are described as righteous. And then I mentioned this about Timothy. We have no one like him. We wore 2 of these out, and while we were in Campbelltown, Lynn McMillan is a wonderful man, elder in the church, at one time head of the Bible department, counselor, just godly to the core. And the McMillans brought 3 campaign groups, but they lived at our house. And again, Annalise is so much like Sheila. I'm guessing she's 6 years old. And about a month before, she said, Dad, do you think Lynn McMillan's going to heaven? I'm thinking, what on earth? Where did that come from? She said, he's been with us twice, and here's this elder and Bible class teacher and head of the Bible department, and they stay in our house. And she said, I have just been wondering, is Lynn McMillan going to heaven? And I just, I said, well, sweetheart, he's going to be coming in a few days. You'll need to ask him. I really can't answer. I think he's going to heaven, but you need to ask him, and I forgot all about it. Well, you can imagine the chaos. 8 or 10 students getting them from the airport to Campbelltown. We get them in our house, and we had an upstairs. I come downstairs, and these counselors have this no emotion, listen very carefully, but you can't tell, and he's got that down to a T. Lynn McMillan's on the couch, and the 6-year-old girl is sitting in his lap with her arm around him, breathing on him right here. And so she's looking him right in the eye so he can't do that counselor facade thing. And I just come around the corner, and I just step back, and a 6-year-old says, Lynn McMillan, are you going to heaven? Oh, I should have warned him. I forgot all about it. But I thought, he's a big boy. He can take care of himself. And then I thought, good luck. And then the interrogation started. Well, are you sure? And she asked him questions about his faith and did he believe in God and all this stuff. And you can just see this adult grown man is just in an absolute state of shock because he's thinking, I have never had a conversation like this in my life. And plus, these eyes are right here looking for every emotion and studying my face. When I grow up, I'm going to be a counselor. So here the counselor's working the counselor over, and she's just doing this whole routine. I'm holding myself up and can't breathe. I am just about to fold because I thought, that's just her mother's daughter. And then it went on, and she says, do you have good friends? Are they a good influence on you? Do they help you to do what's right? And you can tell Lynn he's just struggling. And then she says, well, who is your friend? And Lynn said, well, my friend is James Cale. And James Cale taught psychology and preacher in the church and all this stuff. And here came the whole thing. Well, does he encourage you to do the right thing? Has he ever tempted you to do wrong? And Lynn is just struggling to go through. And then he's wanting to kind of turn the tide. He said, well, Annalise, do you have a friend? And she says, yes. She said, my friend's name is Jesus. Do you know him? Lynn McMillan later said, I don't ever know when I have felt any smaller than this, that here the preacher and the elder and the leader of the campaign and the head of the Bible department has told a 6-year-old, my friend's name is James, with appropriate questions about his influence. And the 6-year-old says, oh, my friend's name is Jesus. How does a 6-year-old know that? From the day she came home from the hospital, we have been reading, Jesus is the friend of children. And because she's 6 years old, we have been trying to win her heart for God. So I hope this will be helpful in terms of giving you, kind of say, framework, giving you a background. And back with our poker, when we go hunting, you do one thing at a time. If you try to do it all, it's too much. And you stop and think, with the sponge, the worst thing I can do is dump a whole truckload of stuff on my kids. I've got to stop and think their bend, their giftedness, their background, their age, and what's appropriate. And I want to continue to fill the sponge up, but once it's full, I'm going to stop. Because I can keep pouring water on it and no more goes in. And, quick review, help me, 1 to 6, we're going to try to win their hearts, their attitude for God. 7 to 12, transition into their thinking, because that's what's going on at school. Developmentally, that's what's going on with them physically. And then 13 to 18, then we're doing everything we can to win their hearts for God because they're not ours. And what did Hannah say? If you give me a son, he will be lent back to the Lord as long as he lives. And if God blessed us with them as small children, then we want to do our best to be prayerful, intentional, consistent, and help them to know and love God with pick, so that when the time comes and the day comes, they will look at him and they'll say, that's my father. Peter, you want to dismiss us in a prayer, please?
All right, let's pray together. Lord, as we gather here, we've learnt a lot tonight and we've taken a lot in. And for some of us, we're looking at things and we're saying, wow, I could have done better. I should have done better. and we realise that we've got a lot ahead of us to do. For others of us, we realise, well, we have been consistent and we have been doing some of these things, but we can still do better. And we're just so thankful for the reminder from Scripture and for the things that have touched our hearts tonight. Lord, we want to have hearts for you. We want to be involved in your work, and we want to share that with the next generation, with our own children, but for the children here, and for those who we get to share the gospel with. And help us to be mindful of all of these things. We do pray that we will take these notes and read them and digest them and think on them and ponder on them and put them into action as well in our lives. We realise that for some of us here, we've got young children, and the things we've learned tonight, we can say, wow, I can really put this into action right now, and I can start this today. But also help us to be thinking about our spiritual family here as well, and say, well, we can do this for all of those who are here, no matter what their age is and where they are in their walk with you. Once again, thank you so much for this time that we've got to share together tonight. May we continue to learn. We're looking forward to tomorrow, to being challenged again and to continue to learn and to grow. And then, as Dale has shared with us, be together with our spiritual family, the rest of our spiritual family again on Sunday, as a great day of worship as well with our extended families and more. And we're thankful for those opportunities. Pray this now in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, what?
2 to 4 tomorrow.